we are recording, but I just want to say your name properly. I'll cut out this first section. How do you say your name properly?
Bob Minhas.
Welcome to the Author to Authority podcast. And today I'm excited to have Bob Minhas on the show. And one of the things that's been really powerful about this podcast is the incredibly interesting and powerful people that I've been getting to meet through it. And Bob and I had never really met before, though we do have a lot of connections. We know a lot of the same people, but him wanting to be on the podcast allowed us to have this initial conversation. And now I feel like Bob's like this kindred spirit, and I'm just so excited to have him on the show. So welcome so much, Bob.
Thank you. Thanks, Kim, for having me here. I think I'm with you. I know that we had our previous conversation before the podcast, and I know that we scheduled 30 minutes and it took us about 90. I think we spent so much time just chatting away and then learning halfway through that we are only an hour away from each other. It was incredible, for sure.
It was wonderful.
Yeah.
Now, Bob is the authority to high-performing corporate and entrepreneurial leaders with his intense circle of expert value system to validate and clearly identify their vision and their focus. And he's the expert's expert. He shares about positioning you to attract opportunities naturally. He's combined coaching, business ownership, education, and life experience. They align him perfectly to position you as the wanted expert in your field, all while injecting his gifts of intuition and business sensibility from a combined 17 years of entrepreneur experience. And today we are actually going to be talking about the basics of how to build your expertise online. And if you are a professional, if you're an entrepreneur, if you're a coach, there is so much competition out there. You know, there used to be a time, maybe even 30 years ago, when you could position yourself and you'd be the only one in your niche, at least locally. And because there was no internet, right? Unless you traveled the world or you read a lot of books, you know, if you could be that expertise locally, you had it made. But now there's so much competition out there because all people have to do is go to Google and search what they want, or go on to YouTube, or they see something on Facebook. And so it's very hard to get noticed in that crowd. So I know today Bob's going to share some hints and tips on how do you start to build that expertise so that you become that well-known expert, the one that everybody wants to go to. But just before we get into that topic, I do want to give Bob an opportunity to introduce himself and let the audience know a little bit about who he is.
Thank you, Kim. I feel like the bio you read was pretty intensive, and I appreciate that. You know, my story is I think it's interesting, but I think it's interesting because I think it's applicable to the fears that many entrepreneurs I meet face or have. So, you know, I worked in the corporate world for some time in telecommunications, and then I lost my job in 2008, and I freely admit, not because of the recession, but because I was a bad employee, and I was forced into entrepreneurship.
I like that. Honest. You're honest.
Yeah, you know what? You can look it up. Bob was a bad employee. And I kind of got forced into entrepreneurship. I started a business out of necessity, and I had a side hustle, but I just knew I had to make income for my family. So I built this business simply on survival and reactiveness. And it was great. Like, we did really well. And, you know, we were on HGTV and had a lot of great experiences. And then when my ex and I separated or got divorced, it just collapsed the business. And it was interesting because I realized then I had not built a business that I had not really built a real business. I had built a job for myself, right? So it was a big awakening, and I spent, you know, a good year trying to figure out myself. I technically was homeless. I was sleeping on couches here and there, and in the car, and it just wasn't a great experience.
And you live in Ontario and you were sleeping in the car?
Yeah,
I
like
hope it wasn't winter.
I went through a winter or two, but you learn again,
Oh.
you learn how to make those things work. And again, not every day. There was, I had friends whose couches I could crash on, and certainly family I could stay with. But the term homeless is really you don't belong anywhere. That's really what it was for a year. I was just everywhere and nowhere. So, I just made that up. I should use that, Kim. I was everywhere and nowhere. So I ended
See,
up
being
getting.
on the podcast, it just brings out the word ninja in you.
It does. Well, you work with authors. You have this way of bringing things out of authors. I love it. Or want to be authors like me. So I ended up getting a really cool job with the government, and my job was to go into these small communities and help business owners build or start or grow their businesses. So I did that for about 3, 4, 5 years, and it was an amazing experience because I learned a lot about entrepreneurship as a whole in both small towns and large communities. So the time came when I realized I wasn't happy in what I was doing, and it was all about me. It had nothing really. I won't say it had nothing to do with them, but it was a lot of me as well. So I ended up deciding I wanted to make a leap, and I thought, okay, well, what is it that I want to do? What am I good at? I went through all the processes that I walk my clients through, right? Figuring out what do I love to do? What am I good at? And I ended up realizing, going back into consulting, being an entrepreneur, but consulting as an entrepreneur was the way to go. And I started in different things, right? So I left the job about over a year ago, did a little bit of business coaching, got into this idea of helping people leave their jobs to start consulting, and then landed on this, which was this idea of how do you turn an average leader, so somebody that's a leader, but maybe they're average in their space, into an expert online identity. And it really comes down to how do you get found by the right people online for the expertise you have? Because Kim, I think what happens is we all have knowledge and expertise, but you said it. There are so many other people who claim to have the same knowledge and expertise, whether they do or not is a whole different podcast. But it was this idea of how do I help people stand and rank out? And that's what I wanted to talk about today. So that's kind of where my story came was, I built this brand years ago based on expertise. My first company that I had, the one I was forced into, I didn't get on HGTV because of ads. I got on simply because I knew how to build a reputation and how to build a network. So that's kind of where I was, and now I'm here in this new place. And I'm, although I don't have the same government swagger that comes, I think my mom worries some days, right? But I'm happier, Kim, and that's what I always love to get across to my clients is it's really about being happy in what you're doing.
And a couple of things I just pulled out from your story, and I think it's important to note is, sometimes you do go back to a job in your entrepreneurial career, and there's nothing wrong with that.
No, I love that you brought this up. This idea of I call it the fluidity of entrepreneurship, which is that, I think in our economy today, especially, so I'm not even thinking about 10, 20 years ago, in our economy today, especially, and with the prevalence of the gig economy coming up, I think entrepreneurship is no longer one person taking risks and doing things. Entrepreneurship really is about opportunities. To me, entrepreneurship is a mindset of, how you approach opportunity. And sometimes you get opportunities where people offer you a great 1-year or 2-year gig, which uses your skill set, and certainly it has the classifications of a 9-to-5. But for me, it isn't that I have to own a business and be on my own to be an entrepreneur. It simply is how I think and how I operate and how I approach opportunities.
Yeah, like I've always been thankful because, I have a husband who has a good, decent job, so that has allowed me to build my business at the pace that I can and am comfortable with, and still keep, a good family and good life structure. But if I was trying to do this on my own, I'd have to be working and trying to build the business at the same time. So, it's a journey. And sometimes you step back from the journey because there's things that you have to do, and then you step back in again. And all of it's learning. Like that time that you spent in the government, even though it was a job, it was such valuable learning for you.
It really was.
To prepare you for this next stage. And everything you go to prepares you for the next.
I can't even tell you the things I learned that I meet entrepreneurs every day that have no idea about resources and programs and
Mm.
just ways of thinking. I had no idea. I'd been an entrepreneur by that stage at 12 years and didn't know that these programs even existed in my
Yeah.
own community. So it was a huge thing. And I think what's really interesting is, you know, when we talk about entrepreneurship as a way of thinking, as a way of approaching opportunities, I think you touched on a really important point, which is this idea of growing at your own pace. It doesn't have to be this $1 million business in a year, that we see a lot of tech businesses going through. It really needs to be something that's reflective of what you want to do. And when people say to me, well, if I go back to a job, does it show that I failed? You see, my whole mantra, like my whole
Mhm.
thing around entrepreneurship is it's designed to give your life choice. I didn't have to go to the government. I chose that job because it was an amazing opportunity. Now, granted, it was also good money, and it definitely gives me benefits for my family. But when we see people who are approaching opportunities, understand that it's not always out of necessity or scarcity. Sometimes we choose the ability to work in an environment for a year to do exactly what you just said, to learn new things, make new connections, meet new people, and try new things. Entrepreneurship is fluid, right?
Yeah.
Although it is a way of thinking, it's also it's being able to be fluid and adaptable.
And I think it's about never being too late. Like, just because you take a
Hmm.
job doesn't mean you failed. What it means
Hmm.
is you recognize that there's things that you are just not prepared for yet.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so you're doing the best possible thing for your life, and you're taking a job so you can live and eat and your family can survive. That's called responsibility. I applaud it, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And it's something that you can always come back to or build slowly while you're doing other things. I mean, I was just, when you were talking, I was thinking about the story of Colonel Saunders.
Hmm.
He didn't
Absolutely.
start KFC. Okay, it's Kentucky Fried Chicken, but we all know it as KFC. I mean,
Correct.
he was 65. He had lived
Yeah,
most of his life as a
yeah,
broke, depressed, suicidal loser. I mean,
yeah.
that's his confession. Okay, I'm not
Yeah, yeah. No,
I'm
I
not
get you. That's
saying, but that
true.
was his
I'm
confession.
validating. No, you're right. I remember reading that. You're right.
And it wasn't until he was 65 that
Hmm.
he finally just decided to become an entrepreneur, and he started this business. And then he
Hmm.
learned things, and he learned how to sell chicken, and then he learned how to sell franchises, and it
Hmm.
wasn't, he was 65 years old, right?
Hmm.
So to me, that means it doesn't matter how old, how young you are.
Absolutely. That's another important thing that I'm glad you brought up is I think for a long time, many of us, and it was given to us by the media, believe that entrepreneurship was for the young, right? For those who had the hustle and had the drive. And, entrepreneurship, and I keep saying it over and over, it is really a way of thinking. But as a younger person, entrepreneurship's great because, yeah, you can make the mistakes and bounce back from it. As you get more mature, get around my age, certainly you're going to end up taking risks, but you take more calculated risks, right? This idea of entrepreneurs jump without a parachute and figure it out on the way down. That's not entrepreneurship, right? Entrepreneurship is it really is subjective at every stage. When you're in your 20s, yeah, you can make that leap and build the parachute. But when you're 40s, you have responsibilities and commitments. In 2020, many of us are in a sandwich generation, Kim, and we have to be mindful of two, not just
Tell
our
me
parents,
about it.
our kids, but our parents. So,
I'm actually in the middle of three.
there you go. So I find that with entrepreneurship, as you get more mature, there really shouldn't be anything holding you back. I've seen people in their 60s retire and then start a consulting business but the key I want to get across to him is it's always about choice. If you follow the generally prescribed methods of building a business, like if you take the time to educate yourself and invest in yourself, not just on the business building skills, but on the mindset skills, there is no reason why you can't. Anybody can build a successful business. Some will have a propensity more than others, but there's no reason why anyone at any age can't build it. And so when you meet people who've done it and then return to the workforce, as long as they're doing it by choice, if something's not worked, like if their business is not working and they look for a job, I usually try and talk to them and say, hey, I understand you've got to do what's
Yeah.
best for your family, but if this is not working, I would ask yourself why. What isn't working? Have you invested time? Have you invested education?
Yes.
Because I think quitting to get a job is
Yes.
a very different thing than someone like you and I saying, oh, Random House Publishing, offered us a deal for a year because they've lost someone on maternity and we're the best fit, and you get to learn and make industry contacts.
Mhm.
That, to me, I would take that gig. I'd be like, yeah, because that would be awesome.
Yeah. And I think the thing is too, is that it's, when you do take that job, it's not a matter of quitting. But
No,
like you said, sometimes before you quit, you have to ask yourself the right questions.
right.
And sometimes
Because
it might just come down to one skill set that you need to
mhm,
learn. And if you can
exactly.
learn that one skill set, you've got it
Mhm,
made. Like, I think one area where, people fail is
mhm.
they love their business, but they hate sales. Well, I'm sorry. If you cannot sell, you do not have a business. And yes, I know sales is the S word, but if you cannot sell, you have a hobby, you don't have a business. So,
Yeah.
you know, and I think today's economy, it's a lot easier to sell because it's now a relationship based economy. It's
Mhm,
not the old school hard selling manipulation methods, which I think
mhm,
is actually really going to lead us naturally into the next section. And
mhm.
I thought I would open it and then I'm going to let you loose with the fact that um, to build that expertise, I think one of the key words is
Mhm,
authenticity and
mhm,
being your authentic self.
mhm. Yeah, that's a really great point. I love that word. I use that word, but I find in the industry you and I are in, Kim, it's an overused word. I don't know that people really appreciate and understand what it is. So here's
Mhm.
how I describe when I talk about authenticity is, when you're building an expertise business or when you're building yourself as the expert, the first thing you're going to do or going to want to do is really define two key parts. The first one is the demographics and psychographics of the audience you want to have or that you can speak to, and then the niche of that audience that you're going to be in. And so when it comes to being authentic, the first thing I tell these potential experts is you're going to want to build an audience around one that's relevant to you. So when
Yes.
I hear an expert say, Bob, I've been a mom for 20 years. I loved being a mom. My kids have aged out, but there's so many things and stories I want to share and I want to give people, right down to the mindset of being a new mother. I get that. And that has authenticity. And that in turn, authenticity value has brand value. But when I meet someone who says, Bob, I'm in my 20s and I really want to sell expensive cars to rich people, I start to say, okay, well, is that a family you've come from? Do you understand that area? When you try and create something that's not you
Yeah.
to talk to an audience that's not one that you understand, those are usually experts that flail, that don't quite hit it home because they can't resonate with the community that they're trying to be a part of or trying to be an expert in. So I guess I'm trying to get across, Kim, is expertise is no longer about knowledge.
Yes.
Expertise is now more about who you are, what you represent in terms of your core value, and then of course knowledge adds to that.
It was funny. I had a conversation a few weeks ago. I was interviewing someone, and we got on the topic of parenthood, and this person was sharing their views on parenthood. I
Mm-hmm.
really didn't agree. Um, and then we get talking about it, and then this person says, well, I've never been married and I've never had kids. I'm like,
Ah, okay. Yeah.
you have no clue what you're talking about. Like, one of the things he said did make sense. Like, it wasn't that everything he said didn't, but it's just, it was kind of like, yeah,
Yeah,
no,
it's
don't.
akin to I'm seeing a huge increase in the amount of life coaches in their 20s on Instagram. And again, it's not to say that these people haven't lived a life that's worth learning from, but when it comes to life coaches, to me, I need someone that's lived long enough to have at least made enough mistakes to be able to teach me. Right now, that's my definition. If you
Yeah.
were a 20 something year old, you would say, no, Bob, I'm happy. I'm in my early 20s. If I meet someone in their late 20s, I feel like I can learn from them. That's great. But the key here is the authenticity has to come out in terms of, are they coming from life experience, or are they just reading something from a textbook? There's nothing authentic about
Yes.
reading from a textbook or a coaching course to actually do that, right?
Yeah, and I that is a really important point, is that
Mhm.
you really can't teach or solve someone's problem that you have not
Mhm.
experienced yourself.
Yeah, mostly you're right. I agree.
Well,
I
yeah,
mean,
there's some
there's
areas
very
that you can
few. Yeah,
expand out into,
very few. Yes, I
but
would agree. You're right, 100%.
like a 20-year-old telling me how to be a grandmother,
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry, that's
If they I don't know, I'm trying to see how that would work. I guess if they had an amazing grandmother and all they did was share stories about their amazing grandmother,
oh yeah,
that could be a coaching program. But even then, it's like, you're right. And that's where authentic. This is the word we're trying to talk about. Is that's where this authenticity comes from. Is you've got experience. Another example I love to use is I can't work with a personal trainer that's never been fat, right? Like I'm a
yeah,
chubby guy. So when I work with a personal trainer, I'm in and out, right? So when I work with one,
yeah. Somebody
I
who's been thin and never struggled with weight
never
their
struggle,
entire
right?
life.
So they don't understand those pain points, those difficulties, those emotional components. It's not that they're bad people; they're really
No,
good at what they do. The knowledge is there, Kim,
yeah,
but what's not there is the authenticity, and that's what I'm trying to say. Is being an expert is no longer simply about knowledge.
that's right.
You really need to have some level of authenticity in experiencing what it is your audience and the niche of that audience experiences.
And I think something that's important to note as well is that you don't have something for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Being authentic is finding out who you are and who you are called to help,
Mm-hmm.
and not being upset or trying to stretch yourself thin trying to help people who you were never called to help in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah, it's you really and it's funny. You're putting we need to put business methodologies into this concept, right? So
Yes.
you really need to know your demographics and psychographics. And for the audience that's not aware, demographics are those statistical characteristics, right? Gender, education, marriage, relationship status. Psychographics are personality traits, right? So how does this person think? What do they believe in? And then I've even added more recently this idea of value graphics, which is, what's their
Mm.
political affiliation? What's their cultural and religious affiliation? Because all of these things sort of define who people are and who you are to those people, right? That's where those 5 core values are essentially defined from.
Mhm.
And then coming into the niche of that. So we can all say, like Kim, you and I can both say, we can help authors. But
Yes.
I know you can help authors very differently than how I would help. I couldn't do what you do. And so when you and I don't have this problem, but when we meet people who struggle with niching, who say, yeah, I work with authors. How? Oh, I write the book for them. I help them get it published. And then I get I get it online and then I get it on Amazon and I make it, and it's like, well, okay, but tell me more about these authors. Like you do all these things, but what kind of authors and what specifically do you do? So, I work with authors who are over 40 and they've lived a life and they want to share their story or they have something they want to share. And I work with authors who are women because I understand that their stories sometimes don't get out there. I think their voices
Well,
get less heard than men, right? So niching down is another business component that's important in developing authenticity.
sometimes it's as easy as what type of authors do you work with? Do you work with
True.
nonfiction authors? Do you work with
True.
fiction authors? Do you work with
Absolutely.
people who do poetry? Like, do you
Absolutely.
work with people who do children's books? Like,
Yeah.
all of these categories
Yeah.
require specifics. Now, there's commonality, okay?
Yeah.
Because I've had many discussions with all different types of publishers, and
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of commonality, but there's also a lot of areas where there's differences, and
Mm-hmm.
how you treat fiction and nonfiction alone is huge in
Mm-hmm.
terms of marketing, positioning, how you use the book.
Mm-hmm.
When you're writing a nonfiction book for your business,
Mm-hmm.
you're not looking to make money off of the sales of the book. Now,
Mm-hmm.
is that to
Exactly.
say that you don't make some money off the sales of your book? Yeah,
Right.
you do.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
But you don't make a lot, and you're not making your living from selling a book. Now,
Mm-hmm.
when you are a fiction author, predominantly you're
Mm-hmm.
looking to make money from the sales of your book. So
Mm-hmm.
you're looking to market to sell a lot of books because that's how you're making your money. But when you
Yeah.
write that signature nonfiction book, it's not
Mm-hmm.
about selling the books. It's about the
Mm-hmm.
positioning. It's about the influence. It's about getting that book into the right people's hands.
Mm-hmm.
So,
That's
again, it's
exactly it.
about that niching down, right?
That's it. And that's where the expertise really starts to flourish is when there, 100 life coaches. What makes you the life coach that, these people, that the right audience is looking for? And I think as experts, we're so happy. Like when I was a business consultant, I was a generalist. I could talk about anything in business. Well, then people didn't know how to refer me, Kim. What would happen is someone would say, does anybody know anything about this random question that had to do with business? And they'd say, ask Bob. Ask Bob, ask Bob, ask. And although that seems really cool, the trouble with that is people don't really know what I do or have a sense of how to refer me. And so when it comes to creating that expertise online, developing that audience demographic and psychographic and understanding your niche, and then communicating that online, whether it's in a book you write, whether it's in a podcast you do, whether it's as simple as your LinkedIn profile, you really need to make those assets, if you will, resonate with these two definitions, the target audience and with the niche.
Yeah, most definitely.
Right? Yeah. And I think when it comes to ranking online, Google loves that stuff. The more that Google sees, Google has just recently gone through an update with the BERT algorithm. And so when I work with clients, it's often on the concept of not just doing keywords and SEO tactics. It's, how do we take your messaging? We work on your messaging. And how do we create that brand? And then how do we communicate that online? So what happens typically, Kim, is somebody will go to a website designer, get a really beautiful website done for their speaking business, but they've not thought about how Google's going to interpret that speaking business, right?
Yes.
So what we like to do is we say, okay, let's develop that messaging using audience definition and niche. Let's really develop a visual brand. And now let's think about what are words or phrases that your audience needs to know. So when they're looking on Google for you, or when they're searching on Google, you are that at least in the top 10 ranking and getting listed at that. That's where opportunities to speak and opportunities for guest blogging or even co-writing a book with someone comes from. And when you have that really definitive niche, it's really easy for opportunities to come to you instead of you having to hustle and look for them. I'm not saying it's 100% come to you, but it certainly makes you much more sought after for something you're already doing instead of you having to tell people, like me, love me, tell me I'm pretty. You know what I mean? That's it. That's how we do sales today. Like on digital media, like me, validate me, tell me I'm pretty. That's really what we have to get into. And, I think when you can get to the place where people come to you and say, Kim, I really love what you do. Can you tell me more? That's enough. That's what you need. That's how it works.
And I think you brought up an important point that I think we don't think about as entrepreneurs. And I mean, I know I've been guilty of it, and I've started to recognize it as soon as it starts to happen. But, sometimes I get on the social media and, I see these people and they're off on this vacation and they're speaking at this place and they've got their picture with this person and that person. And you're like, I don't even feel like I can afford a coffee today.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And
I'm with you. It's, everyone, we call those of us that are more aware, like you and I, we call it the highlight reel. We get caught up in people's highlight reel. We don't actually see the dirty iceberg underneath. And what's interesting to me is I think it's important. I tell all my experts to do that, right? Take pictures of where you are. I always want my experts to show the life that they can help other people get. That's, assuming that's the transformation. So I think it's wonderful, but I think you hit it on the head. It's not about them posting. It's about how you and I interpret that, right? Do we feel like, are we comparing ourselves to them? So first of all, is that apples and oranges? Second of all, why are we comparing ourselves to them as opposed to celebrating them? Ideally, if they're on your social network, you have a relationship with them. So I find, when I try and switch it and celebrate them as opposed to be jealous of them, that in turn gives me those good karma points and I feel good about it. So we are all guilty of, you are 100%. So that's how I work around it, is in my head. I think, first of all, am I comparing apples to apples? Because maybe they're a speaker that's been doing this for 20 years and I'm really only been a few years in the game. Or, maybe they focus on a very specific niche like tattoo removal, talking about tattoo removals. And actually, I'll give you a good example. There's a woman I know, she has an amazing niche. She talks about gaming addiction. Her name is Elaine. She talks about gaming addiction and she gets all of these speaking gigs. And certainly that can be intimidating. But then I think about it and I think, that is a relevant topic that people want to talk about and no one else is talking about it. And Elaine is talking about it from life experience, going through it with her son.
yes.
And I thought, I think like, that's amazing. So I celebrate it. I'm like, that's amazing, Elaine. That's awesome. Right. So that's a long answer, but I want you to know I understand. And if it helps, that's how I try and wrap my head around it, is, am I comparing apples to apples? And how can I celebrate as opposed to feel jealous of it? That's how I try and get around. And chocolate milk fixes everything for me. So
I agree. Hot chocolate in the winter, chocolate milk in the summer.
It's so healing. It's horrible. If my personal trainer is listening, I'm in trouble. But it's so healing. I'm under the covers with a straw. Oh, that's the stuff.
I think milk's one of those things that actually, it used to be warm milk put you to sleep. And I think that there's things in milk that just calm you down and bring you down. So,
I'm with you.
you know what, Bob? I think we really need to continue this conversation. So what we're going to do is we're going to end this podcast, and then we're going to come right back on and record part 2, because we're about the 30-minute mark. And I think there's a lot more you and I need to share.
Sure.
So for the audience, Bob, how can people connect with you? If they've just listened to this episode and they haven't listened to part 2 yet, how can people connect with you?
My favorite way is through LinkedIn. I love getting people searching my name, Bob Minhas, on LinkedIn and connecting with me there. I really strive to share a lot of articles and information there. But with all of my digital assets right now, I just love inviting people to connect with me on LinkedIn.
That is wonderful. So here's the thing. If you've been enjoying this conversation today and it has really started to get some questions in your brain, because I know Bob and I are going to be talking about a few things after we're off this call, connect with him on LinkedIn. One of the things about being an authentic person and being that true expertise is you love it when people come to you with questions. You're not afraid of them. You don't get overwhelmed. Sometimes you can't always answer the question right away because you are a busy entrepreneur, but I love it when people message me questions. And I set aside time when those questions come in, even if it's just 2 or 3 minutes, to shoot off a quick answer to the person. And if it's something more extensive, then I invite them onto a call. Let's have a 30-minute conversation and see how I can help you. Right? So don't be afraid to connect with my guests. The reason I bring them on this podcast, and Bob mentioned that we went through a pre-interview. Everyone who's on this show goes through a pre-interview with me ahead of time, so that I'm bringing on the highest quality guests for you guys. But these people want you to connect with them. They want you to ask them questions. They want you to become a part of their tribe. So go to LinkedIn. It's B-O-B, Bob Minhas, M-I-N-H-A-S. And we will put that link in the show notes as well. So this has been Bob Minhas and Kim Thompson-Pinder on the Author to Authority podcast. Make sure that you tune in for part 2, because we are going to continue this conversation. And it will be on the very next episode. So for now, we're going to say goodbye, and we'll see you next time.